Welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Crisis Communications, hosted by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association and presented by Amy Philpott of Watson Green and one of the three members of the Recall Ready team. This is the fifth webinar in our Crisis Communications webinar series. Feel free to access all 5 webinars found on the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Crisis Management webpage at www.gfvga.org. I'm Beth Olson, Director of Education and Food Safety for the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Please note, this is a pre-recorded webinar, but even being a pre-recorded webinar, technology has made it possible for you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. Simply type your questions into the questions text box. At the end of this webinar, all submitted questions will be sent to us and we will send answers via email. There will be an FAQ housed on the GFVGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. If you experience any issues with the audio coming through your computer speakers, please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and the volume is turned up. If you're still experiencing troubles, you may want to use the telephone dial-in option. And lastly, I would like to draw your attention to the handouts box on the webinar control box. The handouts box contains links to today's webinar and other useful tools, such as Is Your Company Prepared for a Recall Checklist, produced by the United Fresh Recall Ready program. Now, with these housekeeping items behind us, let's get to the webinar. Today's webinar, Crisis Communications, will help attendees think about how communications can actually make a difference when a recalling company's reputation is at stake. Again, this is the 5th of 5 webinars in a series designed to help prepare for a crisis before it begins. Industry experts would agree the best time to prepare for a crisis is not once it happens. And for the large majority of instances, most crises are not expected. The Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association has a crisis communication and management plan available for members to use as an outline to help them create specific communication and management plans for their farm or produce operation. It is designed to conform and help address most any crisis, such as a foodborne illness, labor shortage, weather, or the unfortunate accidental employee death. The 5 webinars in this crisis communication series are designed to provide high-level information and overview in a short amount of time. After the webinar, if more in-depth technical information is needed, you're welcome to contact me, Beth Olson, with the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, any of the 3 presenters from the Recall Ready program, or simply attend a Recall Ready workshop offered through the United Fresh Produce Association. Speaking of the Recall Ready team, today our presenter is one of the Recall Ready team trio, Amy Philpott. Amy specializes in crisis communication and reputation management for food and agriculture companies. She works with companies to prepare for product recalls and is a resource for companies during recalls and other crises. Before joining Watson Green, she managed communications for the United Fresh Produce Association, handling the association's communications during several high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks. Amy grew up in California's San Joaquin Valley, where she helped cultivate and market grapes and oranges grown on her family's farm. It is with this great wealth of expertise and renown that I now turn the program over to Amy Philpott.
Thank you, Beth. This is the perfect topic to wrap up this 5 webinar series by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. Communication is often the most difficult challenge companies have during a crisis. So let's talk about why that is and how to overcome that. In webinar 1, we talked about crisis management. That is the actual crisis and how to manage the various components of the crisis. In this webinar, we're going to address crisis communications, which is an element of crisis management. But there's an important difference. Crisis communication addresses how our audiences perceive the crisis. Crisis management is focusing on the actual event, whereas the communication has to look at how people perceive what's going on. And as we know, perception can be different for everyone. This is one of the challenges. So the goals of crisis communication are to minimize the reputational and brand damage, to help control the message, and with that rebuild trust among our stakeholders. It also involves communicating about risk, especially if we're talking about a food safety issue. But even in other events, talking about risk and risk perception can be a challenge. Communicating in a crisis is very different. It's different than our marketing communications, for example, which tend to focus on the product and all of the great benefits, and it's generally a positive message. Communicating during a crisis is a little more challenging because people take on information differently. They also process information differently, and they act on information differently. And that's because it's all based on how we're perceiving the risk of the individual situation. It's good to keep in mind that this also goes for your internal crisis team, that when your team meets and they understand the risk to the company or the risk to sales or the operations, they too will take in, process, and act on information differently. So we need to understand risk perception in order to understand why and how people react to us. So risk perception is the comprehensive personal view of the exposure to danger. And it's that personal aspect that makes it challenging because we're trying to communicate with a lot of different people, and each one may have a slightly different perception. So let's look at the elements of risk perception. First, there's hazard and outrage, and together they make up how people perceive the situation. So the hazard is the actual technical assessment of the potential harm. It's the actual scientific or concrete assessment of what is going on. The outrage has to do with factors that influence whether people are fearful or they're angry about something. And it's the outrage, even more than the hazard, that drives the crisis situations or that drives our communications during crisis situations, because this is what people react to. So therefore, our efforts to reduce outrage are as important as our efforts to actually reduce the hazard itself. So if we're talking about a food safety issue, our communications to people, to our various audiences about the actual risk of the situation is as important as actually pulling the product back, actually conducting the hazard analysis, the investigation, and the corrective actions. So what are outrage factors? Well, here are just a couple of them, and some of them have more impact than others when we're talking about a food safety issue, but you can apply these to any crisis. So, origin of the issue. If it's perceived that the origin is natural, like a natural disaster, for example, then the outrage response will be less than if it's perceived as man-made. That is, it's the company's fault or somebody's fault within the company. That's a higher level of outrage. Unfortunately, with food safety events, while the industry acknowledges that they're natural events and we're doing everything possible to minimize them, but there is no such thing as risk when you're dealing with pathogens or other food safety factors. Most of our audience will see it as man-made. That is, something went wrong at our end. It was something that we didn't do and therefore caused this. So that's why sometimes you get a higher outrage or a response from our audiences that may surprise us. With severity, for example, if it's ordinary, there'll be a lower outrage. If it's catastrophic, for example, if you have illnesses or worse, deaths involved in the crisis, then it falls into this higher outrage category. Personal control is very important. If people feel they have control over whether or not they are subjected to the crisis, then there's a lower perceived risk and lower outrage factor. If it's out of their control and it's involuntary, then they tend to have a higher outrage factor. What's important with this is that we can change this just a bit by providing more information, so that even if someone feels that it's an involuntary action to purchase a food that has a problem with it, if we give them some information about what to do and how to mitigate that risk, then that can help lower the outrage. And there are some other ones as well. Personal benefit, if it's familiar versus unclear. So if it's a problem with a product that people are familiar with, that tends to not have as much outrage as if it's something brand new they've never heard about, for example. Okay, those are outrage factors that influence how people respond to our communications and to the issue. So here are some things we want to remember when we're developing messages or when we are communicating to different audiences. First of all, both the actual hazard and the outrage are legitimate and important in our communications, and we need to recognize both of them. The public responds more to outrage than to hazard, and this is opposite of what many companies do during a crisis. Many times companies will focus on the hazard itself and not the perceived risk or the outrage. And that becomes a disconnect between the company and who they're communicating with. Outraged people don't pay attention to hazard data. That's why telling people that there are 3 trillion servings of produce eaten every day and only a handful of people got sick in a particular case doesn't work, because people aren't going to listen to the hazard data, the 3 trillion servings versus the very small percentage of problems. What they're going to focus on is the outrage that's generated by that risk itself.
Amy, I have a question.
Yes.
So when we look at this point in particular, I feel like our members, whether it's in a hazard situation or whether it's general public not understanding, even things like the pesticides that we use and the necessity for them and things of that nature. If you're in a hazard and you're thinking about the outrage versus the hazard data, and as a company, you're pretty much focused on just responding to the hazard, how would you or a company go about rating the response or deciding what the response needs to be to the hazard data and the outrage of the people? Is that something that someone like you would just help a company do, or is that social media monitoring?
It's both, Beth. It's a good question. So someone who is familiar with the risk communications around food can certainly help. Someone like myself or yourself can help develop messages that balance out that hazard versus outrage message. But yes, absolutely. One of the biggest parts of most important parts of communicating during a crisis is also listening, and that's listening to what people are saying and whether they're responding well to the balanced message that you're sending out there. Are they perceiving it differently than how you intended them to? So it's really a combination of both. Ideally, you would have somebody on your team who is familiar with what has worked in the past and what hasn't, so that you're not starting from scratch. But then it's also imperative that in every situation, you monitor what the reaction is and what people are concerned about, because you may think they're concerned about one thing, that the outrage is about one topic, but really they're outraged about something else. And so you do have to stay on top of it. And social media is a big part of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing is, I think that companies often will point to the media and blame them for inciting outrage. And while it's true that activists and the media will amplify any outrage factor that rises to the top, they're not creating it. They're taking advantage of it perhaps, but it's going to be there, and part of our job is to figure out how to address those concerns. What we find in produce is that oftentimes there is a very low hazard, right? Just what I was talking about. There's a very low risk, but it's a challenge to communicate that and reach the balance that Beth and I were just talking about, that balance between low hazard and recognizing outrage without amplifying it. Right? So we don't want to prompt high outrage by downplaying the hazard, even if it's low, and that's a challenge. So how do we do that? Well, one way we can do that is to think about it ahead of time, to think about these issues ahead of time and think about how we might reach that balance, if you will. So there's more on a general crisis management plan in webinar 1, as I mentioned. What we're going to do today is focus on the communication plan. So if you recall in webinar 1, we talked about roles and responsibilities on the crisis management team, and here are some of them. And then we said that communication really was the umbrella that wrapped all of them together. Each one of these responsibilities requires communication. We are going to talk about communication within the context of a recall, and specifically recall communications. So the first thing is to identify the audiences, and this will be familiar from webinar 1 as well, but I want to circle the audiences that are typically priority audiences during a recall. And they're typically the audiences that you have to communicate with within the first 24 hours of a recall, or some of these folks you will communicate with even before you announce the official recall through the press release, right? So regulators obviously are some of the first folks that you'll be communicating with. Employees, and notice you have different groups of employees. You have those who are going to help you respond. They will be the ones actually answering phones and replying to social media and replying to emails. Then you'll have the rest of the office staff, and then you may have facilities, your packing employees or your field employees, your harvest crews. They're all going to hear about this on the evening news, and you want to make sure they hear it from you first. Consumers, of course, this is a required audience by FSMA. Your plan has to, if you are subject to the preventive controls rule, you have to have a plan to communicate with consumers. I would argue that you should have that anyway, because they're such a big part of recall communications. Your suppliers of raw materials, customers. Customers are also a group that, under the preventive controls rule, you must have a plan to communicate with them. And then, of course, the media. And the media is really just a vehicle to communicate with the trade or your customers and consumers. So identify your audiences, these being probably the ones that are at the very top and that you will have to communicate with almost immediately. Then I like to have a communication grid available, and for each audience it identifies who's going to be primarily responsible for it, the various vehicles that we can use to communicate with that group, a list of materials that we should have templates for, at least most of them have templates for in our plan, and then when those might be used, maybe some basic messages and some questions that that particular audience will be most concerned with. So here's an example, right? We have consumers, primary responsibility. You might have your sales or marketing person here, or sometimes HR will also answer consumer inquiries. Note that in a food safety issue, your food safety person, your quality assurance person is going to be way too busy to take consumer calls. Even if that's what they normally do in their regular job, they will not have time to do it during a recall or a food safety event. So you have to have someone else in charge of this. You're going to use the media to communicate with them. You can use your website, social media, and then here's some materials that you'll want to have templates for in your plan that address consumer questions and messages. And then when will you communicate with them? This is relative timing, right? So this is going to be after the regulators review the news release and when you release that final press release. The messages, I've just referred to a message map here, which we're going to go through quickly. You can have actual messages here. It makes your template rather long, but you can do that. And then any questions that you think they will ask. Let me give you an example. So a consumer may be more likely to ask, sorry about that, let me go back. A consumer would ask, how do I identify the product? If it's in my refrigerator, how do I know? Whereas an employee might be most concerned about, does this mean that I shouldn't show up to work tomorrow? Does it affect production? Does it affect the financial well-being of the company? Or rather, how is this going to affect me? Okay, so each audience will have a slightly different perspective or concern. So in the recall communication materials, the ones that you want to have templates for in your plan, certainly the news release. FDA has templates online. I tend to make a couple of different tweaks to those templates, but if you don't want to do that, certainly they are acceptable. A website statement, FDA will require that you stay fairly in line with that news release that they have online, that template that they have on their website. And it's not a real friendly statement. It's not particularly consumer friendly. So you may want a separate website statement on your website that is more personable, right? Reflects more of the company's empathy. Photos of the recalled product and FAQ on the website is always helpful. Your call center, whether you're going to be answering phone calls internally or you're going to outsource it to a call center, you need your consumer talking points, of course, FAQ, a Q&A that's just internal, that wouldn't be on a public FAQ, and then a routing list or routing instructions so that people like your receptionist who are answering the phones know exactly where to send reporters and customers and government regulators and anybody else who you may get phone calls from. You won't likely be able to keep up with the phones ringing, so you should have a template for your phone recordings, because most likely you will have to have calls go into a message center. Your sales talking points and Q&A are extremely important. You want to contact your customers before the news release goes out. Your salespeople will be some of the first people communicating about what's going to happen. The customer recall notification is required in those FSMA preventive controls rule requirements for a recall plan. So you want to have that recall notification. And again, FDA does have a template online on their website. There's also a questionnaire that you should include with that. And then employee talking points or a draft memo. And these are all templates that you can have in your plan, so you don't have to be generating these from scratch when they all need to be done about 2 hours ago and you're in high crisis mode. So messaging, this can be very challenging for the reasons that Beth mentioned earlier, and because most companies, thankfully, don't have to develop messaging for crises every day. And so it's not something that companies are practiced in. This balance that we were talking about earlier is how simple or complex to make the issue. How much should we focus on the hazard, which can actually generate very complex answers, versus just saying recall the product and not giving a reason. And so striking this balance with a simple but clear message that addresses the concerns and the outrage is what we're looking for. How many messages should we have? No more than 3 main messages. You can't remember more than 3 when you're talking to people, and people who are listening to you can't remember more than 3. So no more than 3. You can have an umbrella message over those 3, and then 3 to 4 supporting points for each main message. What does that look like? Well, you can use a message map like this. A lot of people will use just a Word document and bullet it 1, 2, 3, or use a parenthetical format, which is fine. Other people like a more visual diagram. So you have your umbrella message above, 3 key messages, talking points for each, and notice that we want to always have a statement of empathy. Here's another format that allows you to provide a little more detail. The umbrella message at the top, the key messages above each of the columns, and then these talking points, and then you can provide some detail for each talking point. If it's a complicated topic or crisis, or there are a lot of different twists and turns in it, sometimes this format will allow you to provide more detail, if that's something that is appropriate. And then, of course, the empathy statement at the bottom. So how does this work? Well, let's say our umbrella message is the death penalty should be abolished. Why? It's open to error, it's costly, and it does not deter crime. And then we would have talking points to support each one of those main messages. And then our empathy statement at the bottom, our hearts go out to victims and their families, all of whom deserve justice. What would that look like ideally in a newspaper headline? Ideally, when the media covers our story, they capture our umbrella message and then each of our key messages. And then the talking points would be in the article itself. Now, this is easier to do with an advocacy issue like this than it sometimes is with a crisis issue. But it's still something we want to strive for. And the way you achieve this is being very, very clear and concise in what your umbrella message is and your 3 key messages, and make sure that when we're giving interviews that those come across. So here's another example using the other format. This is Julia Speezer, who's preparing for an interview. The umbrella message, the campaign is going well. The key messages, I came, I saw, I conquered. And then under each one of those, you can see the talking points and a little more detail. Just kind of a fun example. So we go through all I shouldn't say the problem, we go through all the trouble of creating those wonderful messages, and they've been through legal review 4 times, and management has finally approved them, and sales have approved them, FDA's given the thumbs up to our news release, and we send them out, and we distribute, and we announce, and then we realize that maybe we aren't being heard the way that we want to be heard, or that certain messages that we feel are important aren't being heard. Why is that? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, we failed to address the actual concern, that outrage concern that our audience was feeling and thinking. Maybe we misread it, we didn't understand what their concern was, but somehow we failed to do that. Or our credibility is not what it needs to be in order for our audiences to even listen to us, right? So if we're being perceived as a bias, or that we are advocating for a certain position, or that our messaging is self-serving, which can be very easy to be perceived if you're a company, then people won't take us seriously. They won't hear our messages because they won't be credible. Or if our messages are inconsistent, our website says something different than what one of our spokespeople said, or on social media we posted something that was different than what our website says. So it all has to be consistent. Through all of that, we have to be sure that we're showing empathy and caring. Social behavioral research shows that by far, like over 50% of what influences whether people listen to companies and whether they find them credible is whether or not they feel that the company cares about them. So people want to know that you care before they care what you know. Okay, they aren't going to listen to us if they aren't convinced we care about them. So that has to be part of our message. Make sure in your plan that you have a process for approving communications, approving your messaging, your talking points, your press releases, your letters. Okay, who's going to draft each one? And ideally, it would be the same person, so you have consistency. Who needs to review each one? Who has to approve each one? Don't forget legal. Legal should be part of this approval process. And then, who's your spokesperson, and are they ready to deliver these messages? Finally, this is easier said than done, but what you want to do in communicating during a crisis, just a quick summary of it, get it right, get it quick, get it out, get it over with, and listen. Listening is so important. This is going to require that all of these are going to require that you work very closely with everyone else on your team, because the information that we're communicating comes from other people on the team. And we rely on them to give us the correct information. You want it to be quick, but it has to be right as well. Okay? And of course, You want to try to not make mistakes, so you have to go back and communicate all over again. So in wrapping up, here are some principles to live by. Know what your company stands for. Look at your mission. Why are you in business? What do you value as a company? Because it may be the only thing you have to say for a while. You won't have a lot of details. Typically, you won't have a lot of details in the beginning. Always tell the truth. It goes without saying that everything that you communicate has to be accurate and true to the best of your knowledge at the time that you said it. Show empathy, that compassion, put a human face on the issue. It's the only way that you will get people to even begin to hear your message. Don't be defensive. Don't play the blame game. If you are having a dispute with regulatory authorities or you're upset at a media outlet, there are several ways to deal with those. You don't want to go out publicly with a defensive position because it will backfire. And finally, I don't know. Okay, well, there we go. Keep your cool no matter what. It's going to be intense. Everyone is going to be sleep deprived, hungry, irritable. Your entire team is going to be feeling the same that you are feeling, and you have to be cool no matter what. Beth, that concludes crisis communications. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It's been nice to see this from a different perspective. Typically, when I've gone through this process with a member, it's just nice to know that, to be confirmed in the things that we've done and the messaging that we've already put together and things of that nature, the messaging and the plan and the process that are available in the handouts here on this webinar. So there's the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Crisis Management plan, and then there's also a recall response plan that's also there that Amy and Watson Green have created and made available. So if somebody is going through a crisis, or if you are just being diligent and trying to prepare for one, make sure that you check out those handouts and utilize those handouts, utilize the graphs and all of the different tools that are there. A couple of things that really stood out to me, and these have been the areas when we're looking at crisis communication with several of our members that I have found have been kind of the higher points of stress or things that they weren't necessarily prepared for. I have found that consistent messaging is key. Typically, when a member of ours is involved, being the umbrella commodity association here in Georgia, there is often a very specific commodity group that's also involved, any specific commodity. And so having all of the different players gather and be a part of the communication process, I have found has been key, because there's lots of media. They're calling us here at the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. They may be also calling other commodity specific associations. They're calling the actual farm or operation that's being implicated in the outbreak. And depending on how big it is, they may even have news crews outside of the farm trying to get the employees to make comments about what's going on. So I have definitely found that it is critical to take that breath and be diligent in making sure that, again, you're telling the truth and your message is consistent. And then you're also making sure that everybody in your audiences has the same messaging, not to create that smokescreen and not to divert people's attention. But the last thing that I have found that our members need is undermining their voice and undermining the truth that they're trying to get out to the public and to the media. The last thing they need is the simplicity of just inconsistent messaging, creating that distrust. Have you seen that in your work?
Yeah, Beth, it's a great point because it can happen so easily with all parties having good intentions, but the simple step, or rather skipping the step of just reaching out to others who may be communicating about the same issue, if you skip that step and you don't do it, it's so easy to get on different pages and not even realize it. As I said, everybody having good intentions. I see this potential. I'm not saying that it's happened every time, but I see this potential particularly in situations where maybe a particular company has not been identified as a source of a food safety problem, and an entire category is implicated. And I think there are some good examples of where national and state and regional groups have immediately come together to develop a joint statement or a joint set of messages so that they're all using the same messaging. And there's some really good examples of that. Many years ago, we can probably find some examples where folks weren't on the same page, and the companies were saying one thing and associations saying another, and maybe differences in what various associations were saying. So I think there's been a lot of learning, and when those unfortunate situations happen where an entire category is implicated, I think we're seeing a lot more coordination now on the messaging.
I would agree with that. And I would take this time to advise anybody that's listening to this to make sure that you're reaching out to your associations, be it the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, United Fresh, PMA, any other commodity association that you may be a member of, because most of the time we have resources that we can help develop these communications. We can help walk through a crisis. We do that with members, unfortunately, more times than not. But that is a service that we provide and a service that many others do provide. So thank you for that. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, because you deal with this a lot more than we do, is when it comes to the legal representation, which was a small comment in the greater webinar that we're discussing right now. But have you found that a company that has legal representation that does not have experience in recalls, has that created more hurdles than help? And do you have any advice for those of us that may not have that experienced recall legal representation in our Rolodex at this time?
Mm-hmm. There is a definite advantage to having legal expertise on your team that focuses on whatever the crisis is. So if it's a labor issue, having legal representation that knows the labor laws, that is experienced in labor issues, is definitely a benefit. And the same thing goes for any food safety issue. I have been involved in many cases where legal representation literally impacted the relationship between the company and the regulators in a positive way. And there are many reasons for that. they deal a legal counselor who is a specialty is food law, knows the people at FDA, knows the people at USDA. They communicate with them regularly, and they have those relationships. They also know what the limitations are of the law and of the regulatory bodies. So they know if the company's being asked for something that they don't necessarily need to provide, or they know what questions to ask regulatory authorities to determine exactly what the company's position is. So I know it can get quite costly, but I am a true believer in hiring legal expertise in whatever issue you're dealing with, because I have seen it pay off over and over and over again.
Absolutely. So for anybody watching this webinar, I would advise you to check out, I think it's webinar number 3, When FDA Comes a Knockin'. David Durkin with OFW Law does a really great job of breaking down what FDA is looking for, thinking about what your legal implications are, and when you can actually push back from time to time with FDA. So he does a really great job of overviewing that. And while there are lots of other legal counsel out there that do specialize in outbreak and recall law, he is definitely one of those that specializes in that area as well. And I feel like he's fairly easy to work with. So those are the two main things that really jumped out. This looks like it's a really big undertaking to make sure that you have all of the different pieces of the crisis communications plan. But again, in looking at all of this from this high level overview, I hope it just drives home the point and the importance of having these templates ready before you get into a crisis. Can you imagine all of the different cogs and wheels that are turning, all of the tempers and flares and stress that you're under, and you're having to look for and create in a very stressful situation talking points and messaging boards, and figure out who your audiences are and who within your own organization is responsible for doing different tasks. So I appreciate you, Amy, for bringing this to us and overviewing this with us. And again, I hope that this helps our attendees really take a look at areas that they can begin to work on now before they get into a crisis. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, Beth.
As a reminder to all of our listeners, this is a pre-recorded webinar, but you can still submit questions that we will answer. So to submit a question, please type your question into the question box and press the send button located next to the box. At the end of the webinar, all of your submitted questions will come to us, and we will email all the answers to the individual. Again, we'll also keep a running FAQ document on the GFEGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. So in closing, thank you again, Amy of Watson Green, for sharing your time and expertise with us during this webinar. And again, thank you to every one of you who have joined in. You will be receiving a post-webinar survey to provide feedback on this webinar, as well as help guide future topics. Additionally, please feel free to contact the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association or Amy with further questions. We encourage you to explore the handouts box on the side of your screen for useful tools related to today's topic. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. This concludes today's program.